My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome everyone to today's forum, Rescuing the Republic from the Surveillance State, a conversation with Bill. We realize that when you walk into a room, switch on the lights, and the water comes on, it's time
to you in this extremely important moment of history. The world is heading for what easily could become the worst crisis since the end of World War II. Unless we have a change in direction, there is very clearly the danger that the whole strategic situation could get completely out of control. And what makes it so difficult is that there are many interacting elements to this crisis. Now, let me start with a very worrisome aspect. Despite the fact that President Trump clearly has the intention to improve relations with Russia and China, there are also very different tones coming out of some other parts of the US administration. Recently, US Secretary of Defense Esper was participating personally in a war game which was based on a scenario of a, quote, limited nuclear war between the United States and Russia in Europe, which included the use of so-called low-yield nuclear weapons. Now, recently, the United States did deploy exactly such low-yield warheads on submarine-launched ballistic missiles on the Trident submarines. And that deployment of such so-called low-yield nuclear weapons is very dangerously lowering the threshold of nuclear war. Now, this week, there was a hearing in the Senate Armed Service Committee where the US Air Force General Todd D. Walters, who is also the commander of the US European Command and the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, the so-called SACEUR, was asked by Senator Deb Fischer, what are your views about adopting a so-called no first use policy? Do you believe that this would strengthen deterrence? And then General Walters said, Senator, I'm a fan of flexible first use policy. Now, this is Dr. Strangelove in the position of the Supreme Commander of the present US forces in Europe. And this is occurring as the Defender 2020 NATO military exercise, which is the largest maneuver since the end of the Cold War, is moving tens of thousands of US troops and others, like the Bundeswehr, to the Russian border for several months of maneuvers. Now, in light of all of this, the spread of the coronavirus, which according to top health officials is only a step away from a pandemic, naturally shows that we are on the verge of an uncontrollable situation. In Europe, already most international events and conferences have been cancelled, and the Lombardy region of Italy is now under quarantine. It has been named the Wuhan of Europe. People are being told by the media, by the TV, by the papers to get food reserves for several weeks. And already now, the spread of the coronavirus has a significant impact on the real economy. In China, which has, according to the head of the WHO, set a new standard in the fight against such epidemics, because they put up the defense of life as the first priority and did outstanding measures to contain the spread of the virus. Nevertheless, their GDP in the first quarter will probably go down to 0% as distinct of the expected 6%. Now, China probably has the best chance to recover, but for the so-called West, it looks much more grim because the international supply chains have been interrupted and will be interrupted much more. This is now that the effects of the so-called globalization is striking back. The globalization has led to an outsourcing of production into cheap labor markets, such as the food production, which is now no longer under the sovereign control of countries, but under the control of international cartels. We no longer have food security in most countries. Now, the coronavirus, if it becomes a pandemic, or even if it spreads to more countries, is in all likelihood becoming the trigger for the financial meltdown. This is not the cause, but the trigger, because this financial system is already at the absolute limit. Since September last year, the Federal Reserve has been pumping unbelievable amounts of money into the system in the form of the so-called repo loans. The other central banks, the EZB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and others have pushed money into the system through quantitative easing, negative interest rates, and this is just absolutely reaching now an end point, an absolute boundary condition. There is a way out. On January 3rd, when after the assassination of the Iranian General Soleimani, and there was for about 2 days the danger of a very dangerous strategic confrontation, I issued a proposal for an immediate summit between the presidents of the United States, Russia, and China to introduce a new level of cooperation to overcome the danger of geopolitical confrontation. Now, in the meantime, President Putin has made a similar proposal by proposing that the governments of the 5 permanent UN Security Council countries should have such summits. China and France have already accepted. And today, TASS reports, quoting a high-level US official, that the United States would be very interested to have such a meeting on the level of the UN Security Council governments for a new arms control agreement. Now, I think that what we have to do is we have to push the agenda of such a summit to occur immediately, because I think any delay, given the dangers of the military situation and the dangers of the pandemic, the dangers of the financial system, any postponement is really not very meaningful. And this summit must adopt what Lyndon LaRouche has proposed with his 4 laws: a global Glass-Steagall banking separation, the introduction of a national bank in every country, then fixed exchange rates among these different nations, and clearly defined infrastructure and development plans, which then can become as a totality a new Bretton Woods system, and then have an international crash program for reaching a new level in the productivity of the world economy by focusing on a crash program on fusion power, on optical biophysics and other life sciences, and international space cooperation. Now, this is a moment of extraordinary danger, and we could lose human civilization. But if enough forces around the world join in our mobilization to bring this new paradigm about, it could also be the beginning of a completely new epoch. There has been one man who proposed and prognosed all of these developments as early as August 1971. And that is my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who, when Nixon basically abandoned the fixed exchange rate system and decoupled the dollar from the gold standard, Lyndon LaRouche said, if this tendency is being continued, it will lead either to the danger of a new fascism and depression, or a just new world economic order will be implemented. Now, he also worked out the solutions, what can be done, which we have published and will continue to publish much, much more. Therefore, I think that the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, who was innocently put in jail by the same apparatus which was involved in Russiagate and the impeachment effort against President Trump, His exoneration will be key for the implementation of this program I just mentioned. To get mankind out of the present danger and into a new era, I think is absolutely linked to the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. Therefore, I'm appealing to all of you to join the fight for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche and the implementation of his ideas. This is the very best thing you can do to secure the future.
Who is on this stage, and what has happened to the people on this stage? What happened to Lyndon LaRouche? What happened to you? People like to talk about something they call the deep state. We don't mind that, but we know that it is neither a state nor is it deep. We know, those of us that have been involved from those early days of the 70s in some cases and later in other cases, that you're talking about an imperial force. And it's an imperial force that terrifies a lot of people. But it mainly terrifies them because they refuse to submit themselves to rigorous thought in the service of bold action. That's all the problem is. The problem is not involve secret police and funny microchips and weird drugs and subliminal messages and all those other things. It involves the inability to look into oneself and admit that the actions taken by people like Martin Luther King, or the actions taken by people like Malcolm X, or the actions taken by JFK, are only characteristic of the actions that all of us must take in the context of what we have been confronted with ever since the 1960s, particularly coming out of the United States. It doesn't originate in the United States, but it will only be resolved if people in the United States decide to act. We're starting today with someone who's well known to most, and he and his associate who's with him, Kirk Wiebe, have been fighting for 20 years to tell a story. They've told the story. They told the story 20 years ago. They've been fighting for 20 years to get other people to stand up. It's important to say that there is a faction of the American military and military intelligence which is patriotic. It's a faction that intended to defend the United States. And it's a faction that also intended to make certain kinds of engineering and technical and even scientific breakthroughs on behalf of utilizing technology for positive purposes. William Binney, former intelligence official with the National Security Agency for over a 30-year period, attempted to do that and was prevented at a critical moment prior to September 11th of 2001 from doing his job. The United States paid for that. And you can't walk away from that crime. But talking about that from the standpoint of whether the planes were real or how the buildings came down or all these other things doesn't cut it. You have to confront something else. You have to confront what's happening to you right now, apart from your partisan beliefs, your political affiliations. You have to confront the fact that something is happening to all of us, and it's your responsibility to listen to the people that can tell you what that is in such a fashion that you can then take the responsibility that many of us all want to take. Bill has spoken to several audiences, including the one here 3 years ago at Symphony Space, and we're happy to have him here with us today. And so without further need to say anything, I'd like you to join me in welcoming William Binney, NSA whistleblower.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, as Dennis has said, the government we had opted for bulk acquisition for two basic reasons, I think. One was set up by Cheney, Dick Cheney, and that was he wanted to know everything about all his potential adversaries, politically or otherwise. And so that meant he had to have information about everybody. And so the bulk acquisition satisfied his need in that respect. But in the other respect, in the bureaucracies of the government, bureaucrats tend to like to get bigger and bigger budgets and bigger organizations, and so that meant more and more money and more influence. So in order to do that, if you opt for this bulk acquisition on everybody so that you can satisfy Cheney's needs, it also requires them, the Congress, to give you much more money so you can build your bureaucracy. And those are the basic, I think, motivations to do this. But they have known also from the very beginning that there was another solution that would actually do productive things, because when you took the bulk acquisition, that meant you couldn't see the threats coming. There was just too much data. That's why they haven't been able to prevent any of the terrorist attacks that have occurred anywhere in the world, because everybody's adopted this policy and they can't see the threats coming. And this is documented internally in NSA records produced by Edward Snowden, and also MI5 and MI6 records, and some in GCHQ. They are saying, their analysts are telling them, there's too much data. You've buried us. You've overloaded us. We can't see the threat coming. So just for that reason alone, they shouldn't be doing it. But the real point is the solution existed all along, and we were developing that in the thin thread program. It had basically three tenets. One was a deductive approach, one an abductive approach, and one was a inductive approach. So for the deductive approach, we simply looked at social organizations that stayed within the 1 degree of the known bad guys, and did a survey and used that data to pull out information, and only that information, from the data flow that we were looking at. And we were looking at a number of terabytes a minute, so at the time. And we wanted to up that to about 20 terabytes a minute. That was our approach, and that was the deductive side. So that was a human behavior property that showed probable cause. If you're contacting a terrorist, then you need to be looked at. That's the fairest thing. That's easy to justify in a warrant. And in the inductive approach, we used simply you looking at sites that are advocating pedophilia, or sites that advocate terrorism or violence against the West, or bomb making and things of that. And you could try to watch people who visit those sites, so that you can see their frequency of visit and say that they are probably getting radicalized or in the process of radicalization. Or you have people who have cell phones in the mountains of Afghanistan, or satellite phones in the mountains of Afghanistan, or the jungles of Peru, and you say, well, they're dope, or they're terror potentials. So you look at that, those kinds of things. So that's kind of the inductive approach. So far, those two approaches would have caught every terrorist attack in the world before, during, and after 9/11. Every one. But did we do that? No, because that's a focused, disciplined, professional attack on the data against and against bad behavior by people indicating potential threats. And the abductive approach is a little more abstract. It says you look at geographical distributions. If you have a network that's at 1 degree that is distributed on countries that are involved in terrorist advocation or something like that, you need to look at them to see if they're terrorist or any way affiliated with a terrorist attack or a terrorist organization. Once you look at them, if they're not, then you take them out, and you simply say they're out. And the rest of the data you simply let go right by. And what that does is that gives everybody in the world privacy. And it respects the constitutional rights and privacy rights of everybody in this country and every country in the world. Plus, it creates an extremely rich environment for analysts to succeed at preventing threats and potential adversarial attacks. That's the whole point. That was the whole point of why we did the thin thread to begin with, because even back then, our analysts were buried with data. So the end result is that today we have a situation where the key point here is NSA databasing of information, because our country is the only country in the world that can afford all the data storage that can store all the information they're collecting. I mean, they're collecting, multiple petabytes a day. So my estimate of the Utah storage facility alone was based on Cisco routers being put into it. And what they were estimating was 966 exabytes of data going into that data center a year by 2015. So I figured they had to have at least 5 years worth of storage capacity, which meant 5 zettabytes, which is much less than a yottabyte, but still it's quite a bit. And after that, we get a bunch of bytes and a lot of bytes and all that kind of stuff, So those, it haven't been named above a yottabyte, but but the point is, NSA is the key element here because it's a storage facility for not just NSA, all of the agencies in the United States government, all the Five Eyes and all about 9 other countries that are participating with them in this worldwide collection of data and bulk acquisition on everybody in the planet. And all we would have to do is take our rules, deductive, inductive, and abductive, take those rules and run it and process the entire database that's stored and pull out only that which is relevant, then purge the rest of it. At that point, there would be no data available for anybody, like in the US government or the British government or anywhere, to use against their people. So they couldn't be abused. So that would fix the problem. That would mean the FBI, the DEA, the DOJ, anybody in the intelligence community or in the Five Eyes or any of the others could not go into that database and find information on any one citizen unless that citizen had probable cause, warrant-based evidence that they should be there. And that's the way to fix this whole problem and do it rather quickly, because once you take that data out, no one has the ability to abuse it.
Okay. Nice and simple. Let me say that we're going to have an extensive Q&A session, so anybody who will have particular questions, you'll be able to ask those questions. What Bill's just done is provide the solution, and that's what we asked him to do. We're going to next hear from Kirk Wiebe. I don't think a lot of people know much about Kirk, and I'll just say the following, that he and Bill and another gentleman by the name of Ed Loomis developed what is called the thin thread system. This was referred to just a minute ago by Bill. And I'm going to let Kirk tell you a little bit. He has a very specific view about the relationship between intelligence and the Constitution. Kirk?
Yep. Hello. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you to the LaRouche organization for making this possible and for inviting us to address these fine people before us. A lot of people don't realize it, but the National Security Agency, and I'm going to pick on them because I worked there for a long time with Bill, has operated unconstitutionally for about 70% of the time it has existed on the planet. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the people in charge, namely the executive, namely the legislative branches of government, have formed a cabal, a cartel, if you will, that has decided to mass surveil the world, stuff the information in a database somewhere, big ones, and claim that they're not violating your rights under the Constitution. Because they say, yeah, we collected it, although they won't overtly admit it, but we haven't looked at it. And if we haven't looked at it, it hasn't meant anything to an official in the government. Now, if we go back to the late 1700s, just before the outbreak of our famous Revolutionary War, King George of England, it's documented, wanted to put a redcoat, a British soldier, in the home of every colonial settler in the United States. And why do you think he wanted to do that? You know the answer. He wanted to know what they were thinking and doing. Let me suggest to you that with all the electronic devices, you know, if I asked any one of you, how many electronic devices connected to the internet does your family have? I know it's more than one. Probably 4. What do you think? More? I agree. The point is this. Each of those are sources of information about you and those who you love the most. Every detail, every thought that's communicated via those devices can be collected and put in a database. And when someone decides you're important for some reason, it could be anything. Somebody wants to blackmail you. Somebody wants to scam you. You know, the only difference between a good person and a bad person in government is what? What is it? Yeah, really, it's opportunity. And do you have what we would call moral clarity? But beyond that, do you have a sense of what's right and wrong in this nation? The founding document of which is the United States Constitution, and do you care? Well, I would submit to you, we have in the news events going on, namely the attack using the weaponized sources of the intelligence community to subvert a duly elected president. If that's not a warning, what do you think they could do to one of you, or 3 of you, or Bill and me, or anyone else? So the threat is real. It has been abused, and it lies at the feet of people who are greedy for power. It didn't start out that way. It started out nobly. But now we've reached a point where people have decided they know better, they know best how to manage all of our lives. And it's not just an essay anymore. Google knows what you're doing. Facebook knows what you're doing. Instagram knows what you're doing. We are being, it's proliferating everywhere. And now we have the Internet of Things, where even your refrigerator can talk to the Internet. I mean, it's ridiculous. Your whole lives are stuck in a database. So the point of it is, Bill has suggested that there's a way to put the genie back in the box, but it's going to be you who makes it happen. Don't expect some senator, don't expect some congressman, with the exception of Chief of CIA Pompeo inviting Bill to talk about the DNC data hack. No member of government has ever approached him or me and said, would you come talk to a few congressmen about what's happened, your ideas for fixing it? No. Why? They like it the way it is. Your data is available to anyone in 16 agencies within the intelligence and law enforcement communities. That's the threat, and only we can change it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm going to hear now from Mike Billington. And Mike is going to tell you a bit about himself. He is, as is listed here in your little program, Executive Intelligence Review Asia editor. He's author of a book called Reflections of an American Political Prisoner. Mike was offered, I'd rather I say it than he has to say it, after 2 trials, one trial in which he served 2 of 3 years, was offered a plea bargain, which would have meant that he would have simply served time served. No time would have been additional. And all he had to do was claim to be guilty of something of which he was not. A lot of his friends would have had a big problem. And Mike decided, you know what, I don't think I'm going to do that. despite the fact that his own attorney asked to be replaced, despite the fact that Mike said he would replace him. The judge in the case refused to do that, and Mike was given a 77-year sentence. He served 8 years of it. Is that the price you have to pay for integrity in this country? Now, if it is, I will submit to all of you, as you listen to him, you think about whether or not that's the kind of country you want to live in. Mike Billington.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. If any of you have a sense that calling for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche is a pipe dream, or that, you know, Trump would never do this, I want you to put that out of your minds, and I'll try to prove that. This is a rare, rare moment in history for many reasons, but one which I will address is that this is, in fact, the time that the exoneration of LaRouche is both possible, absolutely necessary, and will transform not just the nation, but the world forever. And I want to try to convey that in as clear a way as I possibly can. Let's start by looking at the fact that just last week, Donald Trump pardoned or commuted the sentence of 11 people. Some of them were people who, like myself and my co-defendants, were innocent and were illegally and unjustly charged and tried and sent to prison. Others did commit crimes, but they were subjected to outrageous sentences in order to not just to silence them, but to terrorize other people. The fact that Trump did this and that he also addressed quite publicly and at some length the issue of Roger Stone and the fact that, as he said, he will probably be exonerated one way or another, means that this is very, very much on Donald Trump's mind. And I'll mention that Roger Stone, who is someone who has quite publicly addressed Lyndon LaRouche as one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, has interviewed him, has spoken at our conferences, is very well known to the criminal network within the criminal justice system who have run the entire operation against Trump, against Roger Stone and others. And I'll come back to that. One of the people released by Donald Trump was Ron Blagojevich, whose paper I do not have. Excuse me. No. Somehow I don't have what I wanted to read to you. I will convey in brief some of what he said the day he came out, where he and his wife and his two daughters met outside the house. And he addressed the fact, first of all, that there was no way to thank President Trump for freeing a man from a charge which he had not committed. There was no way to thank him. He said that Trump is a very firm leader, a very tough leader, but also has a huge heart, and that releasing Blagojevich was an act of kindness, which people had to recognize. He then went on to say that he had not, to the people of Illinois who had elected him twice as governor, he said, "I did not let you down. I would have let you down had I given in to this, if I had admitted guilt to something I didn't do, if I had gone along in order to save myself this 14-year sentence," of which he served 8 years. And he then quoted from a Supreme Court justice, Justice Breyer, who said that the idea that people in politics and the political world could be charged criminally for what they're supposed to do as politicians is one of the greatest threats to America today. This is a Supreme Court justice. And that in particular, he said, prosecutors armed with this potential is a grave danger to our system of government. And Blagojevich said he learned that the hard way, as many of us did. But I think it's extremely important that you have people at that level directly addressing the broken criminal justice system that existed, he specifically said, since 1994 when this Crime Act was passed, which was a disaster, which he described as a racist and illegal act. The Lyndon LaRouche, long before that, was convicted and served 5 years of a 15-year sentence from 1990 to 1995. He could have been exonerated by President Clinton. Clinton was considering it. Literally tens of thousands of leading citizens of this nation and from around the world wrote to Clinton calling for him to pardon and exonerate Lyndon LaRouche, but he didn't. He did make sure that LaRouche was released after the first parole potential after 5 years. So he served 5 years of that 15-year sentence. When he was released, he organized here in Virginia a forum before a panel of very distinguished jurists and political leaders and others, testimony on the LaRouche case and on other cases of the misuse of the criminal justice system, in particular the Fröhmenchen case, which was the official FBI doctrine that any black elected official was, by the fact of being black, more prone to corruption and therefore legitimate to be investigated. In that hearing, I want to read some of what Lynn said himself in that testimony. He said, "We have, in my view, a system," and this is long before the 1990s and 9/11, this is back in the 1980s. "We have, in my view, a system of injustice whose center within the Department of Justice, especially the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The problem lies not with one administration or another, though one administration or another may act more positively or more negatively, but it's the permanent civil service employees who are coordinators of a nest of institutions in the criminal division which show up repeatedly as leading or key associates of every legal atrocity which I have seen. In my case, when the time came that somebody wanted me out of the way, they were able to rely upon that permanent injustice in the permanent bureaucracy of government to do the job. Always there's that agency inside the Justice Department which works for a contract, like a hitman. When somebody with the right credentials and passwords walks in and says, we want to get this group of people, or we want to get this person. And until we remove from our system of government the rotten permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it. Odin Anderson, Lynn's lawyer, then presented a series of documents which we'd obtained through Freedom of Information from the FBI, and I'll just briefly mention it included the idea of putting out false leaflets under the LaRouche organization's name going back into the 1960s and 70s. It included Henry Kissinger's letter to the head of the FBI saying, can't you get this guy? He's being very obnoxious. A letter from the director of the FBI to some of his subordinates saying, let's investigate him we don't know where his money comes from. Let's investigate him as being funded by a foreign hostile force, which then calls into being Executive Order 12333, which basically says somebody financed by a foreign hostile force, you can throw the Constitution out and do whatever you want, and others of this sort. So this was well documented. And then Ramsey Clark spoke. And Ramsey Clark, I'm sure most of you know, was the Attorney General of the United States under President Johnson. And he became our lawyer for the appeal when we were first convicted in the federal case. And here's what he said, first of all, in a letter that he wrote to Janet Reno, then the Attorney General, same position he had held. He says this case, the LaRouche case, I believe, involves a broader range of deliberate and systemic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge. A tragic miscarriage of justice. In the testimony, the same hearings that Mr. LaRouche spoke in, he said, what was a complex and pervasive utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations, those NGOs, those no-good organizations, focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. The purpose can only be seen as destroying more than a political movement, more than a political figure. It is those two, but it's a fertile engine of ideas and a common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems, regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was the deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost. So this is what the LaRouche case was, and was recognized increasingly by many people. That's why they had to destroy him and try to poison his name in the media, to prevent these ideas from being placed at the accessibility of the American and world population. Now, clearly, it's exactly this same network that went after Donald Trump. I don't think I have to explain that. It's pretty obvious. In terms of my own case, I think to get at that, I want to say something else about Roger Stone. You probably all watched The Raid, the great raid on Roger Stone's house. A 66-year-old man with no criminal record attacked at, 5 in the morning or something like that, with, of course, CNN standing out there. Everybody watched this horrible criminal being put in handcuffs and dragged off. Well, I'm very familiar with that scene. On October 6th of 1986, the day of what we called the Big Panty Raid in Leesburg, armed forces from many different law enforcement agencies raided our offices, surrounded Lyndon LaRouche's house, and when my wife got up that morning and was taking the garbage down to the end of our lane, she saw a whole slew of armed men in police cars and CNN ready to come in, for some reason not coming in immediately. So we called our neighbors, John and Renee Sigerson, who happened to live near us at that time, and said, why don't you come over while we wait until they come in and arrest me? And so we were sitting there watching the Marriage of Figaro, I think, on a video, when these men finally decided to come running up the road with their guns drawn and surrounded the house and pulled me out and put me in chains and took me off and so forth. Why? And CNN, my wife came out and said, get the hell off my yard. You have no right to be here. So that was, so this is something that was going on then and is going on now. In my case, there was something of this deep state, so-called, directly involved. A fellow named Oliver North, some of you probably remember, who was at that time running through the so-called Iran-Contra operation, a scam where we were arming terrorists in Nicaragua, and the planes unloading the guns that were being shipped down to them, just as we were shipping weapons to Al-Qaeda in Libya and so forth. Were coming back loaded up with cocaine. We exposed that this was a drug-running operation, and that Oliver North, a good friend of Henry Kissinger and others, was running this scam. And then we found out that Ollie North was also running around raising huge amounts of money, stealing really huge amounts of money from people, telling them that this was to fight communism, it was to save America, and so forth, when in fact it was financing arms running and drug running. And one of the people they scammed was somebody who was a major contributor to us, and in whom I was in regular contact. Oliver North told her that you have bad people who are trying to undermine your doing good things. Therefore, you should let me tap your phone, which was done. And they monitored our calls. This was not just to get me, but it was to be fully on top of exactly what we were doing as an organization at that time. So I think that's the reason I was hit particularly hard with the indictments. I was indicted both in the federal case and in the Virginia state case. The railroad, as we called it, went forth. We were all convicted. I won't go through the ugly details, but it's worth reading. And I got 3 years in the federal case, and then, as Dennis explained, I was told in the state case, where I was charged with crimes that could have been 90 years, that I simply had to lie, and I could go home. So that didn't happen. And as a result, I got a 77-year sentence. Many of the people I met in prison when I said I had a 77-year sentence said, "How many bodies do you got?" So I did not. And I want to read something that Dennis actually read at a previous event and which really struck me from Martin Luther King. He said, "You may be 38 years old, as I happen to be, and one day some great opportunity stands before you and calls you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause, and you refuse to do it because you're afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you'll lose your job. You're afraid you will be criticized or that you'll lose your popularity. Or you're afraid that somebody will stab you or shoot you or bomb your house. And so you refuse to take the stand. Well, you may go on and live until you're 90, but you're just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but the belated announcement of an earlier death of spirit." Now, I can assure you that my life is a proof of that fact, because I did have to spend a total of 10 years in prison. But I can honestly say these were the best years of my life. My only problem with my fellow inmates was my trying to convince them that this was the only chance they had in life where they didn't have to work, they didn't have to support a family, they should learn, they should read, they should not waste away feeling sorry for themselves. But I was given, really, the assignment of China. I mean, 77 years, you know, you got 5,000 years of history to study. You need 77 years to take that on. But it became a real passion. It was something we needed to do. My co-defendant, Will Wirtz, was at the time translating Nicholas of Cusa, who was the relatively unknown great mind of the European Renaissance era. And I was then reading Confucius and Mencius and another relatively unknown but magnificent figure called Zhu Xi during the Sung dynasty in the 12th century, and saw the comparison between what I was reading of Cusa and what I was reading of these Chinese, and was able to pull together a sense of the way in which the great Christian Renaissance of Europe and the Confucian Renaissance, where Zhu Xi, like Cusa, was restoring the Platonic tradition and the Confucian tradition, which had been lost over the Dark Ages in both Europe and China. So this was it was a profound chance for me to really make great discoveries, which enriched my life and through my work, hopefully enriched the world and made those who put me in prison very sorry that they'd given me the opportunity to do that. And then lastly, I'll say that there was one particularly profound experience. At one point, another of my co-defendants, Paul Gallagher, and I were in the same prison. And we formed a classical chorus. So we had a chorus of people, of criminals, some fairly serious criminals, child molesters, murderers, but people who, with one exception, had never participated in any kind of classical music, were totally unfamiliar with classical music, had never tried to sing. But we had been trained in some bel canto methods, and we began to train them. And we sang Bach, and we sang Schubert, and we sang some Negro spirituals. And in particular, we sang Beethoven. Now, this is the year of Beethoven. Our theme is to think like Beethoven. Many of you may have seen Helga Zepp LaRouche 2 weeks ago gave a forum here in New York from Germany on Fidelio, the great opera by Beethoven, in which the lady Leonora dresses as a boy, Fidelio, and goes to work for the warden of a prison where she believes her husband is being held illegally and secretly by a tyrant. And through this story, she eventually frees her husband. And this, a very powerful story, and you can imagine why Helga loves this story, with Lynn having been in prison this time. and I had a similar experience. My late wife at that time traveled the world meeting with presidents and world courts and so forth, addressing this injustice to Lyndon LaRouche. So one scene in this great opera is called The Prisoner's Chorus. This is where Leonora Fidelio succeeds in getting the warden to let the prisoners out for just a moment to get some fresh air. And they come out and sing this male chorus called O welche Lust, Oh, what joy, to breathe the fresh air again. And they think about freedom, 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 Freiheit, Freiheit. But then they remember that they're being watched and they sort of skulk back into their cells. Well, we sang this at the prison. And it had that in particular, the whole thing, but that in particular, that Beethoven principle, had a profound effect on every one of those people. And I've told this story before, and I tend to choke up when I say it, but every one of them at some point afterwards came up to me to try to express that they had never known of this kind of beauty in the world. And excuse me, let alone that they could participate in the creation of that kind of beauty. So, so when Lyndon LaRouche launched the Manhattan Project here in New York, with the intention of creating a vast chorus that would sing both the classical repertoire and the Negro spirituals, because these were not just popular music or gospels, these were songs that were about the fight for freedom and had a classical nature in that sense. I understood exactly what he meant, that this was the way in which we can build the necessary movement for, for a true renaissance. So the Schiller Institute's motto has always been the Schiller motto, that the path to truth is through beauty. And that this is an example of why building this course, there was a music abend last night, and I understand that those people who went and participated in the music, who were being recruited to our political ideas, but it's through participating in this kind of great culture which we've lost in America, with the ugliness that now passes for culture. That this is the way we create the potential to reverse the decay and the collapse of the civilization that we're living in, and actually creating the new paradigm that Helga addressed. So I think this is why, if we make this possible, that LaRouche is exonerated by a President Donald Trump who wants to achieve what he says in terms of bringing the world together around these powerful ideas of development, of science, of cooperation, and great culture, that all of these ideas of this brilliant man, these beautiful ideas, will be made available to everyone, which has been denied them for these last 40 or 50 years, which is the great crime of the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche, that these ideas were prevented from being known and uplifting the population. So this is where we stand, and I think this is why we have this kind of a fight to expose and destroy, whether you call it deep state or British intelligence, destroy those who have purposely set out to destroy both the culture as well as the economy and the participation of our citizens in this kind of commitment to what in fact can and must be a new paradigm. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Well, we were going to take a break, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to actually, no, I'm going to tell you why. Because you have a moment of tension. You don't let the tension go by.
Yeah. Right.
Because you have to ask yourself a question. How does somebody like that spend 10 years in jail? And you and I don't do anything about it. It's not a question of guilt. Because the issue is, how many other people is that happening to? How many people without movements? How many people that don't have the words? How many of the people who just are trying to live their lives, and because of surveillance, and because of ambition, greed, or who knows what, they're suddenly swept up in a process which is not personal, but it's a collapse of a civilization. And it victimizes us all unless we take the ideas that you've heard and fight back. Now, what I'm going to do is, I think we have some microphones, I believe, and I'm going to take a question from the audience, but I'm going to take one which was texted, because this was to Bill, and it may probably help get some other things going. So, Bill, I got a question for you, and this is about, well, it's really about Russiagate. The specific question is, can you address the reliance on CrowdStrike? Why is the intelligence community relying on CrowdStrike? I think you should explain to people what that is so they know, and then just do your...
Well, well, I was telling Michael here that basically they tried to do the same thing to us, put us in jail under the espionage law, the 1917 espionage law. They were threatening to indict us on that. The only reason they didn't was because I had assembled evidence of malicious prosecution on the part of the Department of Justice. And so I threatened them with that and publicly, or over the phone, read to Tom Drake, whom I knew his phone was tapped by the FBI, so I was really talking to the FBI guy on the side. And I was reading all the evidence I had about malicious prosecution. So I told Tom, because they were going to indict us. So I told him, I said, when they indict us, tell your lawyer we're going to charge them with malicious prosecution when they take us to court. And then I hung up. And it's the only reason that we weren't in jail, like you. That was the point I was trying to make. That was the connection that I had with,
Well,
we all had.
the other thing I'd like you to do, is to say a bit, because you guys both got raided by the FBI.
Yeah.
Just let people know so they are aware of that.
Yeah, we also, Kirk Wiebe, Diane Rourke, and Ed Loomis and I signed a DOD IG complaint against the NSA for corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse. And we're required to do that, by the way, by regulation. Right. And so when we did that, that was in September of 2002, they sent a team of inspectors out, about 12 of them, to investigate the NSA. And it took them 2.5 years, and a part of that process, NSA tried to subvert their investigation, and they found out about it, of course, and they came back on them for that. But so there was only more corruption, evidence of corruption there, and so they found out everything we had said was true, everything, you know, and so that was sitting there, and that caused NSA a lot of problems. In fact, at the time, the report that the DOD issued in 2005 was suppressed. It wasn't distributed like normal reports would be because it was too damning to NSA, because it exposed so much of the corruption and fraud, wasting of tens of billions of dollars. And so that was the part that left them with a very bad taste and a vendetta to get us somehow. So in 2007, after the New York Times article about the warrantless wiretapping program, which was only a minuscule part of what they were really doing, they thought, actually the DOD IG, the Inspector General himself, gave our names as potential leakers to the New York Times for that article. Of course, we weren't. And they knew that, of course, because they had all our phone calls, emails, and everything, because they collected it with the bulk acquisition at the time. And we knew that too. So, they still trumped up this charge of this basic. They said we had some other agency's sensitive data, and they raided us, all 4 of us. The ones who those of us who signed the complaint against the NSA. So that we got raided on the 26th of July of 2007. Very similar to Roger Stone, with only about half as many agents. But and guns drawn in my case, and everybody else seemed to get a little disturbed and taken aback by the thing, and all I was doing was at the time getting rather angry at them for being there. So I started accusing them of things like, you were sent here by somebody outside the FBI, right? And of course, it's like kids getting caught with their hand in a cookie jar. you know, you could see their physical body reaction that says that was absolutely right. And the guy who did it was Gonzalez, I'm sure, the Attorney General at the time, because this was the morning of the second day after his testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee explaining the terrorist surveillance program, for which he only talked about the minuscule part, you know, the warrantless wiretap that was exposed by the president. Well, we knew all the rest of it, and we also had a propensity to go to committees in Congress and tell them the truth, which, of course, the administration didn't. So they wanted to silence us, not keep us off balance, and so on. That's why they did the raid. So, but at any rate, the whole thing came out in the end. They ran away after we exposed all their malicious attempts at prosecution, and we haven't heard from them since.
Kirk, I'd like you to do one thing here, which is to explain to people what it is that in your thin thread program became so threatening. That is to say, you guys figured out how to do things very efficiently, and go ahead.
Yeah, you know, a number of years had passed, and I would find myself thinking, what nation would attack the very people developing the most advanced capabilities within the lawful guidelines of the Constitution to find bad people, to prevent attacks, to prevent crime, whatever it may be? Why? It was anathema to me. I couldn't figure it out. And I wasn't street smart enough to realize that evil exists in the highest levels of government. You don't want to admit that. You want to have faith in your government. And it was a shocking reality that hit me upside the head and said, my God, it is that simple. Evil wants to control the outcome. So my belief is that ultimately it was their fear of us providing capabilities that if they were in the hands of a number of people searching through data, scooped up by the NSA and others, that we would see things being done by the very perpetrators within government that were unconstitutional and evil. And it's for that reason that they erased, literally, all the hard drives of the capabilities that we had developed. Yeah, shocking reality.
One other thing, while you have the microphone, and then what we'll do, everybody, is we'll take a break after this for 10 minutes so everybody can get your questions ready, and then we'll just go at it. Explain what happened with the individual that came to see you guys. His name was Black. Was that his name? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is very interesting and very telling. I remember, and Bill was there, the deputy director of NSA, who was the man most influential in getting this guy promoted to the senior ranks of technical director at NSA, said, I want to come down and see what you've developed. And we were joyous about that. Here's the deputy director. We've been fighting to get clarity and understanding and sharing what successes we had had. Here's the second man in charge coming down, and he did. And we sat around the table and showed him, and he said this, and I quote, my God, you have made major breakthroughs. Why are you being so modest? We weren't being modest, but the levels in between us in a lab atmosphere and all the layers of bureaucracy up to him weren't letting the word get out because they wanted dollars. They wanted to win. There was what I would call an unhealthy competitiveness amongst organizations within the government. And so it was really bad in terms of a great outcome for the American people. And so we were very excited by his comments. It certainly meant for us that he would go back up to the 9th floor of NSA and share what he had seen with the director none other than Lieutenant General Michael V. Hayden, United States Air Force. We never heard from the 9th floor again. Not again. It was clear, and we saw this reinforced later, that Hayden had told Bill Black to shut up because it was his agenda that he wanted Congress to hear, not what was going down in terms of our success story. Yeah.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll take a break. It is now 6:11. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? You know, that'll stretch to like 12. But do that. Let me also point out to people that there is this book by Mike Billington, Reflections of an American Political Prisoner, in the back. So let's take a break, and then we'll come right back to do questions. Does it taste good, Rosie? With microphones. Again, I would ask people now, again, you probably need to turn off your cell phones again, put them on mute, and we will resume. Okay, I'm going to start us off with a text message because people, of course, are still getting into your seats. This question is directed to Bill Binney, and is, could you please describe the results of your investigation of the so-called Russia hack and why you think evidence of Russian involvement was faked and by whom? So that's the basic question, and then there's a couple of others.
Okay, well, that comes in two parts. One is the DNC part, the other is the Guccifer 2 part. And there's, of course, other aspects like the Internet Research Agency that was accused of being a troll for the Russian government that was in court recently challenging the U.S. government to prove it. And the U.S. government failed, of course, because they had absolutely no evidence whatsoever. And I think the judge admonished the government for saying and told them they should never refer to the Internet Research Agencies as a troll for the Russian government again, because you had no proof that it was involved in any way. So that's one of the lies that was the basic foundation of the Mueller report and the Rosenstein indictment. The other parts were the DNC email hacks. Well, when we looked at, we had some of our people in the UK are looking at this very closely, and they were going through the posted WikiLeaks emails by, and looking at each and every one of them. There was 35,813 of them. And when they went through, they found all the last modified times on those emails, every one of them. I went through the whole list too. All of them were ending in an even, rounded off to an even number in seconds. Now that's a function of a program called FAT, File Allocation Table Program, that reads data to a thumb drive or a CD-ROM, rounds off that number and stores it in indexes so that you have it on your thumb drive. So, and so that suggested very clearly that this is the clear evidence of a use of a physical transporting memory device, physical memory device, transporting the data to WikiLeaks before WikiLeaks posted it, which makes it absolutely clear it was not a hack. So that's the one thing. That's the DNC email. That's on the side now. Now we're looking at Guccifer 2. Guccifer 2 posted two sets of data. One, the 5th of July, and one, the 1st of September, that he claimed were hacks of the DNC. Well, when you started looking at them and looking at the download speed, or the speeds of transfer, now, when he posted, he put the name of the file, number of characters in the file, and then a timestamp at the end of the file, down to the millisecond. And then the next file, name, number of characters, timestamp, and so on. So if you took the difference between the timestamps and the number of characters in between, you can calculate the speed of transfer or download. So when we did that with all of his emails, or all the items that he posted, everything ranged between 19 megabytes per second, that's 19 million characters transferred per second, between that and 49.1 megabytes per second, 49.1 million characters per second. Now we knew that that could not go over the internet. We couldn't send that to Russia over the internet. It wouldn't go that. It's too fast. They wouldn't handle it. So some people thought it could. So we said, okay, we're going to test it just to verify again that it can't go. So we had a friend here in the U.S. put out a gigabyte of data. And we had hackers in Europe, some of my friends, hackers in Europe, test it from Serbia, Albania, Amsterdam, and Netherlands, a couple places, and then from the UK database center in London, from one database center in New Jersey. And the fastest rate we got from all that testing was 12 megabytes per second, slightly less than 1/4 the necessary capacity to download the data at the speeds that were given by Guccifer 2, or calculated from his files. So that meant it was not a hack, it was a local download, because the speeds between 19 and 49 megabytes per second are compatible with a thumb drive transfer. So there was that, but then we looked even further at the data, and when you looked at it and looked only at minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, both files, the 5 July file and the 1 September file, both merged without conflict. In other words, the time gaps in the file in 5 July could be filled in by data from the 1st of September. So you had like 9 different segments. There were holes in the time sequence in 5 July, and all those were filled by the data from 1 September. So that says he made one download, split it into 2 files, did a range change on the date and a range change on the hour, and that's all he had to do. He couldn't do a range change on a minute because across minutes, there were multiple minutes. He couldn't certainly do it on seconds. You know, it would be impossible to do that. You have to handle every second, you know. There's too many changes. So, but he could do the hour and the date change with a range change. But then there was another part of it too that came out a little bit later, more recently, and that's the guys in the UK found 5 items from Guccifer 2's post in the 15th of June, the early June, where he put it out there and said the Russians did the hack because here's all the signatures with Russian fingerprints on it, some Cyrillic and things like that, anything that a real spy would never do. But I mean, here it is. This is evidence that the Russians did it. So the 5 items that he found, that our guys found from that posting that he made on the 15th of June of 2016, they were also posted by WikiLeaks in the Podesta emails. So the same 5 items are in both places, except in the Podesta emails posted by WikiLeaks, there are no Russian signatures. So that meant, very simply put, Guccifer 2 inserted those signatures into those files to claim that the Russians did the hack. So that meant very simply that Guccifer 2 is an entire fake, and that he was modifying those files. And then when we looked at the Vault 7 releases posted by WikiLeaks, it gave a program called Marble Framework, which is one of the attack programs that CIA would be using, one of tens of thousands of them they had. So in that release. And that program can do an attack on somebody and make it look like other countries did it. Well, the ones they have that they could modify it to do it at the time were Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Arab countries. So that then, along with in the Marble Framework, it said that this program was used once in 2016. Well, it was probably done on 15th of June of 2016 by Guccifer 2, who's a member of CIA, internally in this group in CIA that's involved in the creation of Guccifer 2 and the fabrication of the Russian hack. These are the same people, and in fact, we from another whistleblower who's coming out, we may or may not hear more about this later on, hopefully we do. He is claiming that he set up a program called the Hammer Run for Clapper and Brennan. And that program was set up to spy on Trump and other people of importance that they viewed that were threats. And this was done separate from everything else in the government, so that all run by a small group within CIA. So that meant that here is a separate, and the reason they had to do it separately, see, if they wanted to spy on the President Trump's campaign, or even before the campaign, they'd have to go into the NSA data to do it. And once they did that, there would be a trail, a record of what they did in the network's logs or in any kind of data request they would make. Those things would be recorded and traceable back to them. But when they do it separately with this separate program, a Hammer, using some of the software we developed again, because it effectively could download the entire internet. So in order, they used that to do that and do it separately with this group so that there was no traceability anywhere in government. Even DOJ could not trace what they did. That was what that's the reason what they've done and what they've tried to do. And this is why all this Russiagate stuff is a fabrication of CIA and various other participants in the deep state.
Yeah, let me add one thing. If people say, yeah, but Bill, this is classified information. You know, we can't defend what you're saying. Let me remind people, in the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1950s, the United States released classified information in the form of photographs of Soviet missiles being delivered, transported by ship to the island of Cuba. We released it so that people could see it as truth in the face of evil. Again, recently, more recently, 1989, was it, when the Korean airline 007 was shot down and all those people died over northern Japan? The United States government released the voice intercept captured by the Japanese government, intercepted, of the Soviet pilot saying, I am shooting with my 50 caliber machine gun 4 rounds at that target. We released it to the UN, played it in front of the world. I know, because I was the guy at NSA that received that intercept tape and arranged for delivery to the White House. So our government is known when it's important to go ahead and release classified information to prove our veracity. If this is true, these claims of hack, it wouldn't be a big deal to release that evidence in today's world. It just wouldn't be.
Also, those are the 2 items I also brought up as justification for them to proceed to do that kind of thing with Director Pompeo when I met with him. And, you know, he said, but it's classified. And I used those same 2 examples and said, here's your clear precedent, plus Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, under the regulations of the federal government, the governing classification for the entire U.S. government. It says you cannot classify, maintain classified, or not declassify any evidence of a crime, corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse. So I said you already have the regulations to do it.
Okay, let's go to the audience and see if there's any questions. Somebody in the back there? You got a microphone, Tim?
Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for your honesty and revealing all these crimes to us. My question to all of you is, what do the American people have to do to arrest these criminals who are responsible for these acts, which I can only describe as administrative terrorism against you and other people of integrity?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, as I said it when I spoke, that this is an extremely rare moment in history. And on that issue, you have a president and an attorney general and an appointed investigator, Durham, who are in fact committed to doing exactly that. And this has never happened at this level, you know. I mean, you could talk about Watergate or something, but this is nothing like that. We're looking at the complete capture of the American intelligence community basically by British intelligence people coming out of MI6 and GCHQ, who have captured the U.S. economy over these last 30 or 40 years, and basically transformed our economy into one, rather than being on the American system where the financial system is controlled by elected officials and direct credit into the real economy for the betterment of the population, and instead into so-called free market, free trade policies, British policies, which allow banking institutions to run our economy and make decisions about where credit goes and what gets financed. And what ends up getting financed is bailing out banks rather than building the economy. And this is just as true in the intelligence community, that you have the capture by British intelligence methods over this period of time, which are now finally, for really the first time at a public level like this. There's always been people who investigate and find these kinds of crimes, and certainly, you know, these are some of the best. But now you have people at the level of the president investigating the crimes of the CIA, of the FBI, of the NSA. And there's every reason to be optimistic that this is going to be more than just finding people who committed crimes and putting them in prison where they belong. People like Comey and Strzok and Brennan and Clapper and so forth, because they do belong in prison. Keep in mind that Roger Stone was just convicted for 3 years and 4 months for lying to investigators. Oh, well, look, I mean, Clapper lied to the Congress and to the American people about exactly this program. You know, I mean, these people have lied so much that it becomes accepted because it's a whole different view of the world which people have been induced to accept. Well, that's what can be blown apart. And again, I would say that the LaRouche intelligence operations, our executive intelligence review and so forth, are the crucial ingredient here which can bring this about, in part by bringing the American population and around the world to understand what's really going on, because the media is certainly not going to tell you what Barr is really doing. You know that. So it depends on having this kind of capacity to convey to the population of the nation and the world what is behind what you're reading in the press, and to make that possible by bringing about the actual activity of the American population and the world's population in support of what can and should be done and is being attempted to be done by Trump in some cases and now by Barr and Durham.
In a bit, I want to actually also myself respond. I'll wait. There's another question. Actually, this has in part been answered, Bill, but this is for you. It would be tremendously helpful if we could get Binney to explain how this, meaning I think the Russian hack, can't be a copy of a copy, ergo a file copied locally to a local USB drive. Obviously, you've just said that it is that. Yes. Getting this, okay, his answer would remove a major shroud. But I think he's also asking, how do we know, you're saying that, why does that mean, or does that mean that Russia was not involved?
Well, if he's saying that the people in the DNC attached to the DNC network doing the download, were they Russian? I don't think then they would allow a Russian to access their network, but if they did, it could be a Russian, yeah.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, we got the answer. Very good. So another question out there, and if I'm not seeing you, don't worry, I can't quite, there's somebody there. Right.
Hi. Thank you all for what you've said. Mike, thank you. I'm always moved when I hear you speak. Is that on? Yeah, they can hear me, yeah.
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah, thanks again, Mike. I'm always moved when I hear you speak. On this question that you raised about the evil in our government, I'm very convinced that that is true. Some people might not agree with me, but I'm convinced that an evil force within our government carried out a false flag attack on 9/11, and it was basically an inside job, and that there's a lot of evidence that has come out over the past years through declassifications of involvement of high-level members of the Saudi government who, you know, were directly involved in launching that attack, funding the hijackers and so forth. And in my opinion, they were just doing some of the legwork, but the plot originated with these evil forces in our government. That's my opinion. But it seems to me that that revealing the truth of 9/11 would be one of the only things that is powerful enough to purge our government of this evil force. And I don't know if even getting to the bottom of the Russiagate fraud would be powerful enough to do it. And I think it complements very, very much the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, as it is, ironically, the guy who was head of FBI, Robert Mueller, at the time, he was head of FBI at the time of 9/11, and he was the main man who made sure that the truth of 9/11 didn't come out. He, ironically, was the lead prosecutor against Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s and also ran the thing against Trump. So anyway, I would just like to hear from all of you, and whether you think I'm right or whether you think my instincts are right on that. Is it true that it's not really, we don't really have hope unless we can get the truth about 9/11 out? And if we do, there is hope for this country, but if we don't, then I don't know if anything else would really work.
Well, I for one, am quite aware of all of the evidence that's basically available publicly that has never been addressed by NIST or anybody else in any of the reports they did about 9/11. And certainly those are things that would suggest that it was not just airplanes that caused the problem. Certainly, I'm the engineers and scientists for 9/11 that had that petition to reinvestigate. I signed up to that years ago because it's obvious that our government did not do a proper job in that investigation. And certainly we were not being told the truth. And certainly from the NSA side, we knew that there was a flight of Saudis that were allowed to leave the U.S. even after the shutdown of air travel. So that there was a lot of other things going on that Tom Drake knew about in NSA that said there was other evidence and things of that there were other planes that were supposedly involved and so on. So there was a lot left to be explained. And NIST certainly, when they went through and did their supposed study, certainly didn't explain a lot of the things like molten metal coming out of the buildings, or a lot of how the building 7 fell almost on its footprint, and all of those kinds of things that were visible. Plus some other testimony from fire people involved, people from the fire department testifying, hearing explosions before building 7 fell. Things of that nature that should have been addressed in any competent investigation by a government, were not. And so therefore, there's something wrong here that needs to be followed up for sure. And that certainly would be one of the ones. I think the current Russia investigation is going to take you right into the coup attempt. And that's a part of the other aspects that could also be enough to be justification to really address this in a major way. So yeah, both events, in my view, would be justifications that would be useful and would also generate enough energy to do something.
Can I add something there?
You go ahead.
There's another side to this, too, which is generally not talked about even by the people who are going after the truth behind the Saudi role and so forth, which is that there is a very clear evidence historically on the way in which British intelligence created every Islamic radical movement from the beginning of this process, going back to the end of World War I, the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood by British intelligence, the creation of Al-Qaeda. I think most of you probably know that when the Russians went into Afghanistan, the British and the American intelligence gathered up radical Islamists from around the world, took them into Afghanistan, armed them. They made a movie here in America about the great congressman who helped these freedom fighters. This was Al-Qaeda who fought the Russians. Why were the Russians there? That's another question. I won't go into that. But this was the creation of Islamic terrorism. The whole history of this demonstrates that the British always want to have a hand on both sides. And when they had nationalist governments growing up in the Arab world, people like Nasser, people in Iran, like Mossadegh in Iran, they would create the Khomeini movement, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt against Nasser, in order to make it impossible for other nations to come together around their actual self-interests, like the Arab nations, who were trying to create some sort of an Arab unity around a development process. This was broken. Just the more recent case of the so-called Arab Spring, totally British intelligence run from the top to the bottom. Morsi and Egypt, straight British intelligence asset within the Muslim Brotherhood. So what happened here, I mean, clearly the al-Qaeda apparatus in the 9/11 case, Lynn was actually on the radio in Utah the morning that happened, and his first response was, they're going to try to say Khomeini did it. I mean, Osama bin Laden did it. They're going to say Osama did it in some cave in Afghanistan. Bull, he said. That was his immediate response. But nonetheless, these are the networks that are used by the operatives who are running this. This is the way British intelligence works. So those networks out of Afghanistan from what became al-Qaeda were the tools used by those whose purpose, as Lynn had defined before it happened, when Bush was elected, Lynn said there is going to be a Reichstag fire. There's going to be an event, probably in Washington, which will justify George Bush and his crew, Cheney, implementing police state measures, what became known as the Patriot Act. It happened. Now, do we know all the details of how this thing was run? We still don't. It still has to be investigated. But we know why and how and who the actual authors of this are.
I want to ask Kirk to respond and take this to a different level, because many of you, if you were here when we had a showing of A Good American, which was back in November 2017, the movie which features Bill, and Kirk is there as well. You may remember that the discussion of Thin Thread indicated that, and this is what Diane Rourke actually states in the film, that had that system been implemented as it could have been prior to 9/11, that action could not have occurred. And I'd like, Kirk, maybe you could start us off on that as to say, first of all, why that was the case, and what that means. Because in other words, let's suppose we don't know exactly who in British intelligence did it, and who were the Saudis and the this and the that. Suppose you didn't even have the inkling of a particular, you don't know anything about British history. So you don't know the British intelligence has been doing this for 45, 50 years beforehand. Suppose you didn't know any of that. Suppose you know any of that. Would it have been possible for that attack to have been prevented? So if you could.
Yeah, let me first say from a technology point of view, Al-Qaeda did nothing, absolutely nothing that was difficult for us. They used normal communications lines, commercial, a lot of telephone. Now, one of our own U.S. senators blew it when he divulged the fact that Osama bin Laden was using a satellite phone. And that was Orrin Hatch of Utah. And it was excused. You know, if it were me or Bill, we would have been thrown in jail. But the point of it is, they did nothing, quote, sexy or difficult. We were well on to them and what they were doing. Now, you may remember footage where the former director of NSA, not Hayden, but the General Alexander, Major General U.S. Army, was testifying or answering a question, and he said, oh no, this was difficult because the phone company system, let me tell you, what a bunch of bull dookie. I will keep it polite, bull dookie. That was. It was absolutely false. So I see no reason why the key communications couldn't have divulged the planning for this operation. Now, I will tell you another story, I'll give you a tidbit, because I want to work, and Bill does too, with the organization here in New York that's legally looking into the entire 9/11 operation. We're going to be talking to some lawyers and helping that effort. There's information that I've been given that there was a small analytic group within the National Security Agency that knew about the oncoming attack before it happened, already knew it, independent of Thin Thread. And that doesn't surprise me. I told you, they didn't do anything out of the ordinary. We already understood basic communications at NSA and had cooperation from phone companies and things of that nature. But this small cell was ordered by the director of NSA not to report the information. That is the question, the real question. Why would you have allowed that attack to happen? Why? And we won't know till we get the truth. And I swear to you, we owe the victims and their families nothing short of that truth. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure it gets solved.
I just wanted to add one little tidbit to that so you better understand what the process is here and how stupid it is what they did. Alexander was testifying, that, under the minimization program, that when the call came between some of the terrorists in San Diego, California, to their center in Yemen, the Al-Qaeda terrorist center in Yemen, that was well known. Because we knew the entire Al-Qaeda network by 1996, based on this Inmarsat phone that Osama bin Laden was using. We knew the phone number. We just followed all his calls and reconstructed the entire network worldwide. So we knew them all. So this guy's coming in from Kuala Lumpur, known people. They were known to be Al-Qaeda. And they came into San Diego and then made calls to this Yemen terrorist facility for Al-Qaeda. And checking in, So he was saying, Alexander was testifying, well, we couldn't tell it where it was, because of our minimization process. Well, minimization process only occurs when an analyst makes a pull of data out of the database. In the database is all the data, or in the collection database it's called. That is there. And when it minimizes, it simply blanks it out. So when it pulls out and you have terrorist center calls blank, what that tells you immediately, they're calling somebody in the US, So you immediately go to the collection database, get the number out of the collection database, and that's who they called in the US. And then you give it to the FBI, and they go down and target them. Nobody did that.
Isn't, along that line, isn't it interesting that NSA Alexander claimed, they couldn't tell the connection between whom and whom, but the telephone company has no problem giving them a bill every month.
I would also point out that's how caller ID works,
Okay. Somebody down here? Oh, here first? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for coming today. It's an honor to be in your presence. I was a big fan of Phil Haney, and he was the founding member of Homeland Security, and he was recently found dead. And I was just wondering, with his important work on tracking terrorists and with his, being forced into trying to remove the data, so it couldn't be traced, I was wondering if you just had anything to say about his passing.
I think that it was not suicide. That's my impression. I mean, I just don't think the conditions were right and all. I think they're reevaluating that now.
Yeah, it's an investigation.
Yeah. So, and I think that should be pursued, as a murder, basically.
Okay. I can't see, so you got questions over there?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to alternate between the two sides because I'm sorry I can't see.
Hello. I am wondering if you guys, from a technological perspective, know anything about Indira Singh and her research and activism into P-Tech, and if its relationship to 9/11 and the Saudi government?
Who's the person?
Indira Singh.
Singh.
She used to do risk management for JP Morgan Chase, and she turned activist. When she met with people from P-Tech, who she believes it's related to the Danny Casolaro investigation, who was by activists on, I guess, the internet. They believed he was suicided for his investigation into technology that was stolen by a private company, by the US government, and backdoored. She made the relationship between that technology and this P-Tech company now owned by the Saudis, which the Canadians have looked into too. It's like essentially this P-Tech software has been implemented into high government agencies, private organizations all across the US and international. Just wondering if you guys have ever heard of it? Know anything about it?
No.
I have not. Have you?
No.
It was called Promise. Yes, Promise Technology.
Okay, I do know about Promise, yeah. Bill Hamilton, we've exchanged information with Bill. Yeah, that's what happened is Bill trusted the government and they stole his information, he stole his intellectual property. And he won a lawsuit and they haven't paid him anything since that lawsuit was won, so. Okay, I know about that. That's why I never wrote down any of the intellectual capital we had. So the government could never get it.
Yeah, so Indira Singh has come out, she's done an interview with James Corbett from CorbettReport.com, has done a whole interview with her about linking the Promise has now, she believes, become P-Tech, which is owned by the Saudi government, and the FAA uses it, the IBM uses it, all of this technology that apparently had this back door.
I think probably the best thing is for us to just talk about it, investigate it, and get back to you about it. By the way, I should also just say there are several people that are writing text questions, and we'll forward those on if we don't have a chance to answer them all. But fine, let me move on. Over here. Where are you? Oh, well, there's a lot of questions. Okay, we're going to do as many of these as we can.
Thank you. I certainly hope it's true that this is a moment for openness, and there's a possibility of penetrating these layers of secrecy and discovering what needs to be discovered. I wonder if you gentlemen could comment on the change in the rules for the use of nuclear weapons. As I recall, there was a conference in 2006 comprising top officials in the Pentagon and representatives of the arms corporations. And under that new policy, if the president determines that a region of the world comprises a serious strategic threat, he can delegate the decision to use nuclear weapons to the regional commander. Am I correct in summarizing that conference, and what perspective do you have on that?
No, I just know about the Prompt Global Strike Program, which was approximately the same time. I don't know if we would. Let me put it this way. From the time, let's just do this, from the time of the active pursuit of the doctrine of preventive war, which occurred with Iraq, the 2003 invasion, that was a foot in the door to the revision of what had been the standing nuclear policy of the United States of mutual assured destruction to a policy of first use. Prompt global strike, which was something that began to be essentially discussed but was already being implemented by no later than 2006, was a way of introducing that policy. And yes, the New York Times and others have leaked articles to that effect. In fact, you may remember there was a bit of a row between Donald Trump and the New York Times about this question as to whether or not powers to launch nuclear war could in fact be divested from the president and invested in other areas of government. All of this stuff is a way of trying to shift to something that many of us cut our teeth on. I know that a lot of people here are sitting, and some of you are here and wondering all about, you know, the Lyndon LaRouche connection. What you want to realize is that, or know, is that from 1981 through 1983, Lyndon LaRouche engaged in the back-channel discussion with the Soviet Union on the question of nuclear technologies and nuclear weapons. It began, it was something that was vetted through the National Security Council. It was something that was, the coordinating person was Judge Clark of the National Security Council. These discussions went on here in New York, and they went on also in Washington, D.C. Now, the conception of the discussions was to replace mutual and assured destruction with mutual and assured survival. And this involved what people knew popularly as what was called Star Wars technology, but it was directed energy beam technology that was being developed by both the Soviet Union and the United States at the time. What happened was that LaRouche proposed a policy that was discussed with the Russians, which the Russians believed he had no possibility of actually implementing through the United States government whatsoever. And that, in fact, what LaRouche was doing was trying to profile the Soviet Union, and they rejected the policy. And the negotiators were very nice about it, but the truth of the matter was that Andropov refused it. And when Ronald Reagan announced the policy on March 23rd, 1983, the Soviets were completely caught flat-footed, as, by the way, were most of the people in the Department of Defense in the United States. Virtually no one understood the policy at the time that it occurred because nobody believed that something could be done, which was to talk to the President of the United States about it. The President could announce the policy. There were elements of our organization that were involved in the writing of elements of Reagan's speech. And what happened was that became policy. I'm saying that because what's important to recognize is that the notions of beam defense and beam technologies and space technologies and all these things were things that were being discussed extensively all during the early 1980s. And you can find, by the way, a clip of Donald Trump discussing it in 1999 with Wolf Blitzer. It's a 4.5-minute discussion in which he talks about something called a defense shield. And he references Reagan's earlier discussions about this, which people ridiculed, but now the technology is available. I'm only referencing this because the reason that I think it's important, your question is relevant, I'll just summarize here. I realize that it must be very difficult for many people here, and it's not a matter of being in any sense condescending whatsoever, because the world has become damn confusing. There are no divisions of the type that you've been led to believe. There's no divisions in left and right. There are no divisions in the parties in the United States. You're in a situation which is much different. It's very much sort of like what people popularly referred to as the Matrix of the 1990s. But that's not that useful a reference because it's really a lot different. And there are forces, there are ways, there are means that we can all, as Americans, join together right now. We have to access the idea in our country that we are really involved in something that's pretty dangerous, including potential thermonuclear war right now. But it's also together with viruses, it's also together with a collapse of the economy, it's together with a lot of things. It's a conjunctural crisis. It's not one element. And so I just will say this to you. There is right now, yes, a policy in the United States that nuclear weapons can be used first. But it's also the case that in Russia, there have been a deployment of weapons which are beyond, in certain respects, present deployed American capabilities. And that has acted as a deterrent. The President of the United States is aware of this. Vladimir Putin announced it on March 1st of 2018. You just go back and look at the speech that day and you'll see it. And therefore, negotiations among the various countries are really critical. China, Russia, India, the United States. So I just wanted to take that much and just let people know the reason we are saying this to you around the figure of Lyndon LaRouche and around the cases of all these people who've been raided by the FBI, every single person up here. With the exception of myself, I was just an unindicted co-conspirator in one of the cases, so I'm junior here. But the reason we're bringing this to your attention is because something can now be done. So I thank you for the question. We should...
Let me add briefly.
Sure.
I want to remind people of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in her taped thing this morning. She reported that yesterday, General Walters, the U.S. Europe commander, was asked in a Senate hearing, a Senate or House, I forget which, what is your opinion on no first use of nuclear weapons, which was at least accepted under the mutual assured destruction doctrine. We wouldn't start a war because we could blow each other up. At least it was accepted that there's no first use. And Walter's response, I mean, this is astonishing. This is a top U.S. military general who said, my view is flexible use. I am in a position to decide whether I may or may not use nuclear weapons. First, this is real. This is very dangerous. And then secondly, briefly, just again on the LaRouche connection, when Reagan adopted the SDI, everybody knew this was LaRouche's doctrine. In fact, when they called the White House and said, what is this? What is this? They said, call the Fusion Energy Foundation, which is our organization. And Paul Gallagher, who was head of it at the time, was the person interviewed on the media about what this is, because we knew, because we wrote it. Lynn's idea, we had organized all over the world for years for this idea, and we got it into the president, and he recognized it, and he adopted it. When they were, the people around Reagan who were from the so-called neocon crowd, Schultz and people like this, were trying to get him to give it up. And they had all kinds of means. One way was that they arranged for a major arms control meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev, which took place in Reykjavik. That took place in October of 1986, and they wanted to basically con Reagan into giving up the SDI in exchange for the Russians agreeing to certain kind of limitations. While that meeting was going on, all the journalists gathered there were watching the television films of Mr. LaRouche's house being surrounded, myself being led off in chains. The raid on our office was the news story around the world on CNN that weekend. And this was supposed to contribute to getting Reagan to give up this crazy idea of this lunatic LaRouche. He didn't. He didn't give it up. And as a result, there was no arms deal at that point. But he refused to give up the SDI. So there's more to say on all of that. But I mean, this is all of a piece. Everything we've been going over is of a single piece, which has now come right down to the deciding moment where it's going to go one way or the other.
Okay, let me go to one question which we had as text. This is to you, Bill. Another question that came in is, Binney meeting with Pompeo. What was conveyed and what was relayed to the president?
As far as I know, nothing.
Okay.
I just don't know. Nobody's told me what has been relayed at all.
Okay. Very clear. There's a lot of people down here, by the way, that have their hands up for a long time. So please.
Okay, the mic is on.
Yes.
Hi. Let me phrase this.
I got a question for Bill. You know, you've described very adequately why there was no internet transmission to Russia or any other place, that only a flash drive, thumb drive could handle the data transfer speeds necessarily. But after that, there are a couple of other steps. Julian Assange ends up getting this and then releasing it to the world. Now, Julian Assange has been very, very assiduously steadfast in never, ever revealing the source of his information to protect them. I happen to have seen a Dutch language newscast where he let something slip. And what he slipped is that it was from someone close to the Democrat National Committee. It wasn't broadcast here. And then all of a sudden, one of their young staffers, a guy by the name of Seth Rich, ends up dead in the streets in Washington, D.C. at 4 in the morning with his wallet intact, but no flash drive. Various people have said he was going to meet someone with the FBI and give them the drive. Unfortunately, the FBI was not apparently informed that Assange already had gotten the data. So there's no investigation on this dead kid. His parents are mortified, terrified, and don't want to talk about it, probably because they figure what happened to their son could happen to them too. Do you have any reaction to it from this chain of custody that must have happened for Assange to get it? And one more point. Assange offered a $20,000 reward for information for anything to do with the death of Seth Rich. He has never done that with anybody else. None of his sources of information have ever been graced by an award. Of course, some of them are, most of them are still alive. But if there's a smoking gun, I can smell the smoke.
Yeah, there's a couple more points to add to the things that you raised. First of all, Julian Assange has publicly said he did not receive this data from a state actor. Certainly not, he didn't receive it from the Russians or any other state actor. He made that very clear. And Kim.com is also publicly on the web saying that he assisted Seth Rich in getting the data to the WikiLeaks. Now, he's a member of the WikiLeaks organization, I believe, and so that's another fact. But also Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, I believe, British ambassador to Uzbekistan, said that when he was visiting the United States in Washington, he met somebody on the campus of American University who assisted in that transfer of information. He didn't receive it in thumb drive from him, but he assisted. He said this person they met assisted transferring data to WikiLeaks from the DNC. So there's those facts, plus the Cy Hirsch's illegally recorded statements made from his FBI source that said the FBI has a report on the Seth Rich computer. This is all of what he said. It's publicly available. If you can go on the web, you can listen to it. And he said the FBI knew from the computer they could see he had contacts with WikiLeaks. He was asking for money for WikiLeaks and so on. So that's hearsay statements so far, but not factual evidence that's admissible in the court of law. Unless you can find, the president should be ordering up this FBI report. He can easily do that. It's not a problem with him. He can declassify it if he wants to, which he should. So, certainly there's a lot more to it than what I've said earlier. I just said the forensics part of it earlier. This is the backup statements from people involved in various aspects of it.
Okay, over on this side.
Hi, I'd just like to put this in context. So I grew up in the 80s during the Cold War. I was 3 years old. I had a reoccurring dream. I was in the waters. The horizon was burning. There were Russian subs and sharks in the water. And I was so petrified not to go into this Russian sub that I'd rather either stay in the water, get eaten by a shark, or go to that burning shoreline. And so it's okay to laugh. So today, I'd like to put this in the context of the other individual who was asking about 9/11, right? And people growing up with this kind of stuff. I was 3 years old, and I had to hate the Russians, right? I don't anymore, obviously. And then we have this impeachment of Trump and these massive cover-ups going on. And then the last thing that comes to my mind is Nancy Pelosi sitting there behind Trump, tearing up the speech. So we have these things that these young people are growing up with. I would like you to, if you could comment on how to put it in context for maybe the younger generation, and also, I know somebody on the stage can tell us why we need cathartic events like this. Thank you.
Since you mentioned Nancy Pelosi, I find it, I listen to her down there saying, we have to stand up and defend the Constitution. Well, you see, what a lot of people don't know is that there were 4 people briefed into all the criminal programs at NSA and CIA in November of 2001. They were the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. That's on the House side, it was Porter Goss and Nancy Pelosi. And on the Senate side, I think it was Shelby and Graham. So those people were the first 4. That's how you co-opt in Congress. You get the leadership to first get involved and accept it, which they did, by the way. They accepted these unconstitutional programs. So much for standing up for the Constitution. But the point is that once they accepted them, they were now co-opted in and now had to defend the administration's approach on all these programs. That's why Nancy Pelosi, when she became Speaker of the House, said impeaching George Bush is off the table, because she's already co-opted into the programs. And if she was going to allow the impeachment of George Bush, George would say, hey, you have to impeach yourself too, because you're a part of this. So at any rate, I just had to say that about Nancy Pelosi.
Great.
And I would add, if you do some reading into our history in Congress, what you've seen and this standoff between factions and what I would call incivility, rudeness, disrespect is mild. There in our history, there was a time when fistfights actually broke out on the floor of the Senate. So in our history, which I know they don't teach much anymore, this is really nothing new. I think the underlying issues that have been mentioned and spoken about here are the elephants in the room. Don't worry about these little snits and things. We'll get past those. But the deeper issues and the connectivity between groups and forces are the real thing to keep the eyeball on. Yeah.
The other thing I would add, if I may, you grew up in the 80s. I mean, this is important. We have had a cultural degradation in the United States. I want to come back to this cultural issue. You know, people who grew up in the 50s and 60s, especially in the 60s with Kennedy and the space program, they were given something to inspire them to the idea that they have a future, and that future is involved with science and technology and mastering the universe and bringing dominion over nature. That whole idea, which is, it's a Christian idea, it's also a Confucian idea. But this concept that each and every individual has a role in transforming the universe was really at the very core of the American idea. It was completely destroyed over these last 50 years with the inundation of drugs, with the inundation of ugly music called music, noise, with the basic destruction of the ability of our children to learn classical music when they're growing up, which is almost non-existent in our school system, with video games that are nothing but violence and sex and pornography. The culture has been destroyed. You have these cathartic events which are accepted or terrorize you into sinking into this fantasy world that most people live in, especially most of our younger generations, who've been given no sense of a future. Now again, this is a rare moment. Trump hasn't done everything we want him to do, but he did go with Artemis. He said, we're going to go back to the moon, we're going to go to Mars. He did say this drug stuff is ridiculous. He did say this entire climate change hysteria and fear that we have to shut down the world in order to save the universe is pure bunk. This is giving people a sense, at least, of the kinds of ideas that we've been fighting for the last 50 years, and which finally is at least before the population. And again, why it's so essential that we fight for the exoneration of Lynn and for all of these ideas to be put on the table so that people can stop being afraid of the power of beautiful ideas.
I think we're on this side now, right? Yeah. Good.
Hi, thank you very, very much. My name is Sue Peters, and I'm a member of the American Monetary Institute, and we study the history of the banking system. Our banking system originally came from England, so along with the security forces. And I just want to say, what we always say is President Eisenhower warned us of the military-industrial complex, but he left out the financial military-industrial complex. And I want to applaud the LaRouche people and I forget her name, Helga, for saying the solution of we have to go and change the monetary system. But I just want to say, with studying the history of this, as this is a solution, yes, but Helga is talking about going back to Bretton Woods in 1944. That does not take away from these private commercial banks the power they have to create the money. If we don't take away the power from the private commercial banks to create it, they'll just buy everything back. And I just want to say to the audience, it's the thing that's very hard because our history has been taken away. Very hard to understand, but people in the 1800s understood it. Private commercial banks, whenever they make a loan, they do not take money from one account and give it to the borrower. That's not their legal power. Their legal power from day one in this country is they have the legal right to create the deposit in the borrower's account when the loan is made. And that power funds all of this, and we have to take that power away from them if we're going to solve this problem. Thank you.
The issue of banks issuing credit is different from the fundamental difference between the American system and the British system. The American system was explicitly not a monetary system. What Hamilton devised was a means whereby the purpose of the government is credit, not money. And there's a huge difference. Lynn always used to say, money is stupid. It doesn't know anything. You can use money to build a steel mill or a whorehouse. But credit has a mind. Credit has the idea of a future that is going to be used in order to create something in the future. And LaRouche always said that his forecasting capacity was not a matter of crystal ball gazing on what's going to happen, but how do you create what's going to happen? And it's this concept of credit and a creditary system which we've completely lost, completely gone. With the Federal Reserve, which is itself not a national bank, the way we had a creditary system was through a national bank, a Hamiltonian bank, where the government ran the bank on behalf of the people. The elected officials ran the direction of credit into those things needed for the general welfare, for infrastructure, for roads and power and education and health. That was the American system. Then we were told, oh no, the independence of the Fed, free market, free trade, Adam Smith, who was the enemy of America. But we have to follow this system. This is free market, free trade. This is capitalism. Well, that's nonsense. The word capitalism is itself virtually meaningless. And the distinction to be made in economy is that between the original American system and the British system, which is banking dictatorship over government and over empire, which of course is the core of the British, and which continues, even though the owning of colonies doesn't exist anymore through the IMF and the World Bank and the City of London. And what they're doing today, and in fact it just happened yesterday, is in the City of London planning how they can use this climate change hoax to justify cutting off credit to any industry which produces carbon, i.e. any industry. It's a myth to justify a policy of completely breaking the physical economy and the population of the human race under the guise of protecting our planet. So the issue here is credit versus money. And there's a huge difference. It's something not learned in America anymore because our schools don't teach the American system. And this is, again, one of the tasks that we've taken on, that LaRouche took on himself personally, to make sure that we make this known to the world.
Over here. Somebody, Rachel, you got some, pick somebody.
Yes, right now, there's a very important trial going on in the federal courts in New York. There's a Joshua Schulte, S-C-H-U-L-T-E, is being tried under the Espionage Act. He is an associate of WikiLeaks, or at least alleged associate of WikiLeaks, and he's on trial under the Espionage Act, which is the same act that the Rosenbergs were on trial for, the same act that Julian Assange is being said to be targeted by. And it's one where you face life imprisonment or even capital punishment. And nobody knows that this trial, I shouldn't say nobody, because if you read every square inch of the New York Times, it was mentioned once or twice. But otherwise, it's almost completely secret. The entire media just doesn't notice it at all. And this has been going on now for weeks. Actually, the trial now is in the stage of the closing statements. The defense has rested its case. And what the defendant is accused of leaking is information about a section of the CIA that was created, Vault 5, to specialize in hacking people's computers, namely that of dissidents, people that are doing independent research, and so on. And it even said in one of the articles that Vault 5 would leave telltale signs that would connect whatever information was found with some phony connection with intelligence services of other governments and so on. And this seems to also be possibly the warm-up to the Julian Assange trial, if that manages to take place. So I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel has more information about this. And also, I personally would like to urge people to go to the federal court building at 500 Pearl Street, and I believe it's on the 14th floor of that building, and show some solidarity with the person who's under another obvious frame-up for trying to get useful information out to the people that the media completely suppresses, including this gigantic trial that's going on right now.
Could I just ask you, you said Vault 5. Did you mean Vault 7?
Maybe I got that one wrong.
Okay, don't worry about it. Fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we know about it. But we don't have to, if you want to say that.
Well, I mean, I think this is the fellow who was involved, a contractor working for CIA that took the Vault 7 material out and supposedly gave it to leak, or allegedly gave it to WikiLeaks. These are the allegations against them in the court. Is that correct, I think?
Yeah.
So, yeah, again, it's not a question of in terms of the Espionage Act, if they want to really apply it, they have to show a state that they're doing this for. In other words, with Julian Assange, what they're basically wanting to do is shut him down. We don't want the truth being told by anybody, even though it's truth of the crimes we are committing, you know? So, and I get back to Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, they cannot classify that material. They must declassify it according to the regulations. Anything that's evidence of a crime must be declassified. You can't hide behind crimes behind classification. That's what that article basically says. So, and I don't think that anybody involved in this court case even made an argument in that case for that executive order being applied, because that's the order governing all classification. That should take away this idea of classification in terms of, because Vault 7 shows all the criminal acts that they're capable of performing against everybody in the world. And yet they have not And when it came to cybersecurity, this is the swindle number 2, I call it. Swindle 1 was you had to give up privacy for security. So we will charge you $100 billion a year for that. And then the next thing was cybersecurity. You know, the whole idea was there were hundreds of millions of lines of source code in Vault 7, and they boiled down to tens of thousands of attacks on operating systems, firewalls, you know, private networks, servers, switches, everything in the world that allowed them to penetrate and read and see what you were doing and saying to others and what others were saying to you. So it was so they wanted their window open so they could see what you were doing at the expense of making you all vulnerable. So every time they got an attack, they'd come around and say, we need more money for cybersecurity. And I say that we shouldn't give them a dime, because swindle number 2 is because they already knew what the errors were. They didn't fix them, so we were sitting here open and exposed and vulnerable. So if you don't fix the problems you know about, why should we give you more money to fix problems you aren't going to fix anyway? So, you know, it's fix the problems you know, then maybe we'll have some security. Then if you get attacked, sure, then you need more money. Until then, no.
Okay.
Hi, gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and your bravery. And you mentioned this huge database. I think it was in Nevada or
Utah.
Utah. Do other countries have that capability? And I know the intelligence community, we all work together, friendly intelligence communities. Do other countries spy on Americans on behalf of the American government?
I think the short answer is yes. But actually, other countries don't have the capacity to build all these major storage facilities because it costs a lot of money to do that. And the British, for example, when they're tapping the transatlantic cables through the point in Bude, England, down at the far lower right or left side of the far west portion of England, there are major cable lines across the Atlantic surface there, and so they tapped them there. I think our government gave them $250 million to set up that tapping point. That's because they don't have the money to do it, but we do. And we borrow it, make it, or take it from China or something. Let's add it to our debt. Hey. But at any rate, the whole idea is they still are dependent on us to store the data because they're taking in. It's so much data coming in from the Five Eyes and 9 other countries. And they use, the Five Eyes and all the agencies of the U.S. government use the IC Reach program. It's on the web. If you went NSA program IC Reach, you can actually read about it. So it's all on the web, mostly from Snowden's material, but that's how they query this database that's set up. That's because NSA is doing storage facility for everybody. So, and the other countries that aren't Five Eyes use X-Keyscore, which is a separate query program. It also limits access to that data set. But so they use, also our embassies, I believe, use that, and various other organizations of the government across the world use the X-Keyscore as a way of getting in. But all of that data is being stored by NSA. That's why I say if we focus in on that, fix that, purge it, then you have given privacy to everybody in the world for every country in the world because they're dependent on us to store the data.
And to indirect answer to your question, do we have other countries spy on us? And the answer is yes, we do. And the answer why, to why, is because those countries don't have our laws. It's that simple.
Okay, we're going to go over here next, and while we're doing that, let me just say several people have sort of texted me about the issue of the coronavirus. I will phrase a question, because there's several of them, at some point when we get a break, but obviously there's a lot of people here who still have questions. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Daniel Burke, and I've been an activist with the LaRouche movement for about 8 years, and I am an independent candidate for U.S. Senate in New Jersey. Thank you very much. I want to double down on the idea that we should be optimistic. I think that, you know, in terms of what I've been doing with my campaign, we went on January 28th to the president's Wildwood rally, which was an incredible scene, enormous numbers of people in New Jersey, first time he had came to New Jersey. And we had 25 volunteers, and we had a big, beautiful banner and thousands of copies of my statement calling for endorsing Helga LaRouche's call for a summit between Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping. And in addition, we alerted the people who were there to the fact that Vladimir Putin put through his own proposal for a summit on January 15th, about 2 weeks after Mrs. LaRouche did. And people there really had no idea what we were talking about. It was not on their radar. And we brought it to their attention. We had a very good response out there. There's so much that we can do between these countries if we commit to eliminating the threat of these warmongers like Pompeo and actually creating the basis for mutual benefit. You know, I think that I was in 10th grade when 9/11 happened, and it shaped my whole experience of life. But I have a 1-year-old daughter who Kirk and Bill got to, you know, they saw her last night, and when she's 6 years old, if this Artemis program is successful, she will see Americans walking on the moon. And I think that that's going to shape the way that she looks at humanity and looks at the universe. So there's a lot of things, a lot of reason to be optimistic and means by which these countries can cooperate. Therefore, my question to you, in context, I think, it looks like, as of this report from Reuters, it was actually reported by TASS, that a high-level U.S. official has said that Trump wants to have this arms control meeting between the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK. It looks like we're headed in that direction. And we have about 8 weeks until the Elba Day, which is the day that, outside of the proposal of a P5 summit, Putin has proposed that invited many world leaders, including Trump, to come to Moscow on the 75th anniversary of the meeting of the US and Soviet troops on the Elba. If I were in the position of the people who set up the people on that stage, I would be taking the next 8 weeks to make the biggest, most nasty, you know, explosion of all types of things that I could possibly do to prevent that summit from working. And I'm calling on people here to actually take action in the near term to support that summit to actually take place and to put forward positive proposals to make that happen. And so my question is, what would you do if you could sit down and talk to President Trump? If we could break the containment represented not only by Pompeo on Bill's case, but also Dana Rohrabacher said that John Kelly was the one he spoke to about a potential pardon for Assange, and then never has any idea whether or not President Trump heard that. If we can break that containment, what should we be talking about at that summit?
Well, I think I would, of course, advocate for that summit to the president and tell him that the best advice he can do is to ignore his staff.
Very simple. Very good. Over here.
Hi, I want to thank all of you for everything you have done and continue to do. And my question is about the presence of UC Global in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where Assange sought asylum, that we've learned about in recent revelations, that was apparently live streaming his every move directly to the CIA, including visits with his attorneys. I wonder if any of you could speak to that.
In 2015, I had the distinct honor of entering that embassy and sitting down with several others and Julian Assange, to whom we had brought 2 wonderful bottles of Australian wine. And over the next, I'd say almost 2 hours, we had conversations about all the issues you can imagine. But I would tell you that right after we sat down and he had our attention, he quietly let us know there was monitoring. So he was aware of it. And I think he was careful to steer, influence conversations that we had, and we were all astute enough to be tuned in to what he was trying to convey to us. So we were certainly careful in what we said, yeah. But I'm not surprised at all, no.
Okay. Which have we got? We're over there, right?
My mic is wrapped just because I'm recovering from mono. So it's good to be careful. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. You're all very brave, and especially to Mike. I bet even if there are spies in this room, they're inspired by your story. I just wanted to add something about 9/11, and then I did have a question. I will try to keep this quick. I know that it's easy to ignore the issue or push it off, and I want to remind everyone why it's so important, because if it indeed was a false flag, then as soon as we start succeeding in making peace, then there can just be another false flag, and the government can say, oh, you see, there are terrorists, we can't, make peace with these countries. And I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in this topic to go to Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. They have a lot of really good information on the topic. I'll be standing on the side because I'm trying to put a student group together, and this is something that I do. So if you're interested. And I also wanted to say that, if you're struggling with trying to read about this and it's upsetting, or you want to just shove it away, I ask you to remember that the truth is what it is, so we might as well try and figure out what the truth is. And, ignoring the topic won't make it go away. So my question is, what would you do if you were threatened or asked to be quiet? And do you have any fears about being a target of assassination, or are there any precautions that you take? And if so,
Well, let me tell you about my friend here. Right after we were raided, he looked at me and he said, I don't commit suicide. And let me tell you, for a while, we were honestly frightened by the fact that armed people had come into our homes and essentially, trapped us in the prison of our home for some 7 hours while they looked through everything. They said, think of this as a detailed security background check. You can imagine what I wanted to say to them, Mike.
The issue of assassination is important. LaRouche always used the term factitious advantage, where he said, in order to prevent them from doing what they want to do when they want you eliminated. And by the way, this issue of elimination, one of the documents in that hearing I discussed with our lawyer, Odin Anderson, one of them was a letter from the FBI director to the office in New York, or the office in New York to the director, saying, we have learned that the Communist Party USA is investigating LaRouche to the purpose of eliminating him, believing that his organization will fall apart without his leadership. We at the FBI concur that the organization would collapse without his leadership, and therefore we are proposing that we provide a detailed study to the CPUSA, to the Communist Party USA, a blind document, in order to help them with their goal, to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche. So he would always identify the factitious advantage, meaning the way you prevent that from happening is that you identify who it is that really wants you dead. And they say, oh, you're a kook, you're paranoid. Tell the truth. Identify who wants you dead and how they might use a lone gunman to do it or something, but that you identify who would pay, because we're making it known who they are, just very much the way you said, because you had the information on them, right? Therefore, he was able to avoid many assassination attempts, in fact, lived to a ripe old age. The other thing to say is on the false flags, and somebody earlier had said we have to expose the 9/11 for what it really is. And I agree, and the point is that there have been so many false flag operations which are always done in order to prevent, in this case, President Trump from doing what he wants to do. There was the takedown of the Malaysian airline in Ukraine, which they blamed on the Russians, and that was the beginning of the sanctions, the beginning of the whole operation with sanctions against Russia. There were repeated chemical attacks run by the White Helmets in Syria, who are British assets financed by the British and the USA, as terrorists, calling themselves White Helmets, helping the staging chemical weapon attacks, blaming it on Syria. Trump himself was falsely coaxed and gave in to giving a couple of relatively minor airstrikes on the Syrian government in retaliation for their using chemical weapons, which they never did on their own people. It makes no sense, of course. But these kinds of false flag operations are going to continue as long as people are not willing to fight to get the truth behind these kinds of things. So this, again, I concur with what you said. These have to be identified. You have to have the courage to identify them, knowing that you're going to be persecuted, called names, but also possibly shot, you know. Certainly Martin Luther King knew that when he gave the speech the night before he was killed. He said, I might not make it there with you, but we shall see the promised land. You have to have that kind of courage or else you're not really living. And when you do, then there's a tremendous joy in your heart and in your mind. And life is worth living because you know you're committing yourself to the truth and not to simply some personalized sense of sense perception or sense certainty.
We have about... Unless I'm told otherwise, I believe we have about 10 minutes left. And so one of the things I'm going to do, because I said I would do it, is on the coronavirus. I want to pose something here. Several people have written different questions, but I think they're sort of the characters twofold. One, you have the virus itself and the question of whether or not, of course, it's natural or man-made. There's a second question, which is what can be done with respect to the surveillance technologies themselves? In what way could the kind of thing that you design with Hidden Thread, is there an application that could be made to help to identify cases or interface in some fashion with medical technology? I think the third was, is this being deployed as a kind of a pretext, so you're creating panic way beyond what the circumstances are, leading to the ability to do the kind of things, in one sense, that were done with 9/11, not, in other words, with the violence of 9/11, but just by shutting down whole government functions. So why don't we start with Kirk? Okay, fine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's possible to develop an application to provide what we learned to do, provide early warning of military aggression against the U.S., in this case, virus aggression against our interests, and against all people for that matter. What is simply needed is a set of criteria that are triggers for alerting, right, based on observable data, real data, not human made-up data, and the means to report it back to some authority, some central or distributed, based on those indicators. So it's eminently doable. We just need the world to cooperate to put it into place. And I don't think it would be that expensive to do. Bill, what do you think?
My view of the coronavirus and all that is, you know, if you've ever noticed, if down through the years you looked at it, a lot of these viruses always originate in China somewhere. So I started thinking, well, okay, then there must be something wrong with the Chinese chickens, or else, you know, there's a bioweapons lab developing these things, and they're kind of loose with their protection of the device, or it's a deliberate release of it. So, you know, there's some of those options. My preference is I'd like to think that there was something wrong with the Chinese chickens, but You know, as far as the viruses, sure, we could monitor the transfer, the movement of people and follow that flow with the movement of the virus. Yeah, we could do that.
All right, okay. I'll just interpolate one element, which is it's not my view that it originated in China, but it is my view that when, after 9/11, the weaponized anthrax occurred, that we don't know yet who did it. So I'll indicate that because perhaps there's a way to think about the entire process that is not about coronavirus, but a whole set of processes going back to 9/11 again that require a thorough investigation. Yes, there's been something said about an individual who supposedly committed suicide by Tylenol, which is what was literally said, but a weaponized anthrax that was more sophisticated than could be made at Fort Detrick, a little bit difficult to swallow that one. Okay, so let's go back to questions. Yes.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel here. We were talking about hope, and you gentlemen give us all a lot of hope. You're all American heroes. And to Bill Binney and Kurt Wiebe, what you're doing is exceptional right now. To be able to tell the American people what's going on when you have the elephant in the room, especially with intelligence, because most of us don't perceive the threats. And when Bill points out that everything's being harvested and stored, our cell phone communications, our text messages, our emails, our web searches, it's outrageous. So we talk about hope. Now, right now in the Southern District here in Manhattan, there is a grand jury supposed to be in process. There's a suit against the bar and Jeffrey Berman. He's the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District. There are motions going back and forth now. Of course, the media doesn't tell you that. There's a letter that was received from the Lawyers Committee by the U.S. Attorney, said he received a petition from the Lawyers Committee of 54 pages with 60 exhibits which are dispositive of controlled demolition and bombs in the building. And no one tells you about that in the sense of the regular media. But it's going on right now. And as we talk, that crime, and we keep on coming back to 9/11, and we hear what Bill said and Kurt said, that there was apparently pre-knowledge, and that the system, that thin thread would have detected it if it was made operational. Amazing. Well, there are other future possibilities as far as grand juries of government misconduct and obstruction, and then there's Shanksville, and there's the Pentagon, there's the anthrax. Ironically, Dennis, I'm holding a book called 2001 Anthrax Deception by Graham McQueen, which I'm reading right now, which talks about exactly what you were talking about. So again, I just want to say a point. I salute you all. You're true Americans. Mike, for what you experienced, our heart has to go out to you. But as you said, you made the best of a bad situation for those 10 years. And you come out stronger and a better leader. So you're all under fire. And again, I salute you all. Same with you, Dennis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What we're going to do, we only have 4 minutes left, but I'll say the following. First of all, several people have written questions. Well, I'm going to forward these to Bill and Kirk in particular, as well as Mike. But secondly, if you have a few questions, we will try, as we just have to end the tape, but some people who have individual questions can come down and ask at the end. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to take a minute, and that'll leave me a minute, and then we'll make some announcements and then close the session. So why don't you want to start?
I'll just say, I think it's extraordinary that I don't think anybody has left this room for 3 hours or left their seat. I think in general, if these kinds of ideas can be laid before people who have been denied access to these ideas because of our media, because of the cultural decay, I think this demonstrates that this, when you address these kinds of truthful and powerful ideas, it moves the soul. And this is what we can and we must do to all of our citizens and all the citizens of the world.
Yeah, I would just add that the whole concept of getting truth out to the public is really the issue here, and getting through the mainstream media, the filtering and deception and manipulation of the government and the mainstream media. Getting through that, getting the truth to people so they can make informed decisions is really the hope that we have of being able to try to express the things that we know about what's going on. And so I think that's the main issue. If people understand things and know the truth, then they'll make good decisions.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough the importance of truth. You know how important it is, and we must achieve it. We have to find a way to do it. It's not a topic new to Bill and me. We've talked about the infosphere and what we might build one day if we had the financial backing to produce an outlet that goes through all the filtering based on facts to ensure that if a person comes to a certain website or a set of websites, you're going to get the truth to the best possible degree that it can be known. And it's desperately needed in this country, and I would dare say the world. We're all struggling. Can I believe that? Can I believe that? It's terrible what the media have done to us. They're far more interested in sound bites and echoing each other and arguing with each other than they are with true journalism and investigation.
Just to add on that, just so people know, I mean, our intelligence system, our organizational intelligence, publishes a weekly magazine called Executive Intelligence Review and a daily EIR alert service. And I strongly encourage you to, when you stop outside, to go ahead and subscribe to our alert and become part of this political movement.
You've heard it, it's NSA endorsed. I don't know.
No, wait, Dennis, wait,
I don't
Dennis.
know.
Wait, I can't let that one go. You have not seen me on this stage before. It's through the auspices of this good man, probably helped with my buddy Bill here, that I'm here today. But the importance of having a conduit for truth is absolutely, it can't be stated how important that is. And the fact that the LaRouche organization offers these kinds of things, please take them up on their wonderful offer to help. Yeah, please.
Man, that was what I was supposed to say. Took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, so we have a sign-up sheet back there for everybody that wants to stay in touch and work with us in various ways. Well, we want to do more meetings like this. We do have an upcoming conference, which we'll be doing April 25th. You can find out more information out there. Then again, we have Mike's book, Reflections of American Political Prisoner. And as I said, we will certainly, we'll try to stay around as long as we can, but we are required to end at this point. I want to thank everybody for your participation, your concentration, and your impending commitment to right this wrong. Thank you. Schiller out.